Hi everyone. Today we'll do our second lecture of this online teaching campaign that we started earlier this week. That has been going on since last week. For the lecture today, so I have a new background. I don't know if the fall leaves is more relaxing than the snow of the previous time, but we'll try that. Before we begin, I want to do a few technical things with you. So two things I want to go over before we begin talking about the lecture today. First of all, reminding you the attendance procedure. You have to send me an email with the attendance words. So if you haven't done so from the previous lecture that I sent on Monday, please do it as soon as possible. Send me the email with the lecture that we had and the word that I gave you as the attendance word today, and I can mark your attendance. The other thing is I want to remind you what I asked for Friday. I need to get an email from each and every one of you about who you're going to write the final paper and presentation with and what's going to be the case that you're going to study. So those are the two things that I just want to make sure that we are, that you send me the email by Friday. So let's start today's topic. We'll finish the psychological approach today. Quick reminder on Monday's lecture. So we kept talking about the psychological and social effects of terrorism, mostly focusing on threat perception and different negative emotion, how they impact the main quantity that has been studied is public perceptions and policy preferences facing terrorism. I talked a lot about how studies distinguish between threat perception and anxiety, how the higher degree of anxiety usually led to behavior which is intended to reduce that anxiety, to reduce those risks. Then I discussed the paper by Hadi and her associates, the surveys after 9/11, that distinguish between those two reactions, threat perception and anxiety. What are the factors that determine those in terms of individual factors, age, gender, stuff like that, and how it shapes support for different types of policies and support for the president. Then I talked about the alternative view of anger as the actually main emotional reaction, the political effects of anger, separating between anger and anxiety and their contrasting effects using the data from France in 2016, mostly showing that anxiety reduced the extent of support for right-wing parties, and anger actually increased the support for that, which was very interesting. And then I talked about the other study, the 2002 study by Hadi, that addresses different types of threat perception, personal threat, which is a more a threat to my well-being compared to a national threat, which is for all of us as a group. Again, using these surveys after 9/11 to distinguish between those two and how they translate to different policy preferences. If you have any kind of questions, of course, you're more than welcome to email me, and I will give you additional information if you need about that. Today, we'll keep talking about psychological effects, of course. Most of the studies in that area, again, study the relationship between terrorism and various psychological effects, and the issues that are measured are mostly public preferences with respect to policies to address the threats of terrorism. So today we will talk about two main questions. The first one is the national security civil liberties debate, which is the main part of the lecture. This is two of the papers, both papers that you had in the syllabus are talking about that. And the last one is another addition that I had with regard to the civil rights of the suspects of terrorism. How does the public addresses those issues? So those are the topic that we're gonna have for today. Okay, so first we'll talk about the security civil liberties dilemma or debate. So the main challenge whenever we think about this concept of civil liberties versus national security is that we're facing the trade-off between our democratic values versus versus security threats which may exist at that point. And one of the important factor in this case is the context. The context is a very critical factor in this debate, shaping the debate. Why is that? Because in most cases, in most contexts actually, we pay very little attention to issues of civil liberty. We take them for granted in a way. Our freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the free press, all the issues that we take for granted may change in specific contexts. In those contexts, those issues actually become much more central, and they may have actually immediate implication on our lives. So the main question that we're asking, facing a context of national security threat, is, are we willing to, and how much are we willing to, accept certain restrictions on our freedom in exchange for greater security from the government? And just as an example, so we can talk about what exactly are those restrictions I'm talking about. So we can think about surveillance of papers or communication, which means that the government can track our cell phones or our computers, or there's more limitations to the media. Searching belongings, the government is able to search in our personal belongings whenever they need to. And more focusing on the judicial process, we can think about detention without habeas corpus, which means detention without the due process of being brought before a judge and facing actual clear criminal case. So those are just type of restrictions that we may have to accept in this discussion. So again, coming back to the context of terrorism, the paradox that shapes this entire discussion is that in open democratic society, that's what we're talking about here, democratic values, it serves as a precondition for terrorism. Remember the structural factors we talked about. In democratic society, because of the freedom of movement, the freedom of the press, it's much easier to implement terrorism. And if we want to reduce the extent of threat, we have to accept some restrictions. Are we willing to accept those restrictions? That's a very important question. From a larger social standpoint, it's actually a question of which of the needs that we have are more essential. Is it our safety, our security, or is it our freedom or self-actualization? We can think about it in the context of Harold Maslow's famous pyramid of needs. So this is the question that we're facing here. And what exactly are those civil liberties? So civil liberties is not necessarily an independent contract or belief in this case, but we have to think about it more in the context or as a function of the trade-offs involved, right? So if we accept those restrictions, that means that there are actual costs that we have to pay because we accept those restrictions, and that's the trade-off. How much are we supporting public, how much does the public support government action versus how much are we losing in our civil rights because of those actions? That's how we have to conceptualize, to think about the trade-off in civil liberties. The context are the concept of civil liberties and security issues in the past has been studied or conceptualized mostly as how much do we have to sacrifice the civil liberties of certain threatening groups or disliked groups versus the entire, in order to ensure the security of the entire group of citizens. Now, terrorism gave it a new interpretation because the threat in this case of terrorism makes the question of civil liberties or defense of security for the population as the need to protect the individuals, the member of society, from the action of the government itself. We're not looking here at we are securing the entire population while we are giving up the rights for a certain small group which is threatening or disliked. We're looking at the entire population, all the citizens of the country that are facing different risks because of the action of the government itself. And this is the fundamental element in democracy, which in the American case is actually reflected in the Bill of Rights. So let's start talking about the study. The main paper that you had for today was the Davis and Silver one. Once again, this paper came after 9/11, and 9/11 served as an important role in shaping those study. First of all, as I said on the previous lecture, it provided access to a lot of data to test those kinds of theoretical questions. And second, 9/11 as a severe terrorism case serves an important role as a salient national security case that redefines this trade-off between security and civil liberties. So Davis and Silver describe two factors that are very important in shaping this debate, shaping public preference in this case. The first one is threat perception. So threat perceptions as big as 9/11 generate severe emotional reactions, such as fear or anxiety. And in most cases, fear, anxiety are, from a behavioral standpoint, suggest that we support actions that are intended to reduce the threat. At the same time, those kinds of threats also have a cognitive effect, which increases our willingness to forego some of those basic civil liberties, because we place more attention of information, we seek more information that is intended to reduce the threat. So this is actually leads to a shift from what's called our habitual behavior, what we do in the everyday. We're less reliant or less important for us to focus on social norms such as protecting our civil rights, and we allow the government more freedom to enact actions that are intended to increase our security. The context of terrorism also should be thought about as a national threat. We talked in the previous lecture, I talked about the Hadi et al. Paper that separates between a personal threat and a national threat. Terrorism in most cases is viewed as a national threat. National threat means that the individual civilians tend to view their personal safety as less important than the security of all of us as a group. So that takes the discussion about what kind of policies, what kind of government policies are we willing to accept in exchange for losing some of our individual rights, which are important for our own personal security. So that's one factor. The second factor they talk about is the trust in government. This is an important factor which is part of the overall beliefs of the individual in democratic institution processes. The idea is that trust in government is a crucial factor, because the more we trust the government, the more we're willing to concede personal freedom, in exchange for security that the government in which we trust is providing. So those two factors and the way that they describe them lead to two expectations. First of all, high degree of threat as well as high trust in the government means that those individuals will be more supportive of security-related policies, even if those policies involve violating some of the individual rights of the citizens. On the opposite expectation, those who are low on threat perception and trust, there's actually more unwillingness to forego those civil rights for more security. So those are the two expectations. One more thing that the authors did, because they wanted to ensure that they found that their findings will account for this trade-off for those two factors and how they shape this debate, they also control for a lot of individual and social factors that may impact this relationship. So I'll give you just as an example for some of them. This is a long list of factors. We cannot just think about some of them. For example, dogmatism, conservatism and trust in authority. We expect that those people who have higher degree of dogmatism will be more supportive of security and are willing to forego some of their civil rights. The same expectation for pride and patriotism, more support for national security. On the other hand, you can think about the liberalism and the conservative differences. Even for some of the demographic factors, there are important expectations, especially with race. So African Americans are much more sensitive to issues of civil rights, so how much they are willing to forego some of their rights for more national security, as well as age, since older people tend to be more conservative, and even with respect to community. So those who reside in cities are usually exposed to a more diverse type of population, so will be more open to preserve those civil rights and less willing to forgo them in exchange for more security. So this is some of the factors they also accounted for. So they had data of about over 1,000 survey respondents. You see the time frame very close to 9/11. Overall, and this is the point you can see here in the first type of data finding they have, that there's greater support for civil liberties, so over 50%, actually more in favor of protecting civil liberties compared to preferring security. It's not a great number if you're thinking about it from a democratic standpoint. And it also suggests that it's very hard to measure those kind of questions context-free. We have to think about it in the context of national security versus terrorism threat. But if you look at more specific issues, you can see that the variation is much is different. We can look at right. So most of the public is not accepting investigating protesters, but there is a greater extent of support for teachers criticizing any kind of government policies, even if they're disagreeing with them. Require national ID card. Think about those things. Those are kinds of civil rights that in this survey we see that people are willing to give up on in exchange for more security. So overall, as I said, they find that a national threat in the sense of terrorism reduces support for civil liberties on some specific aspects more than others, increase support in government. They also test for personal threat and find no effect. And they also account, as I said, for many individual psychological and demographic factors. And most of them, the expectations are supported. For example, more dogmatic people, more prideful people are more supportive of security in exchange for civil liberties. Urban population is more supportive of civil liberties, less willing to accept to give up on those civil liberties in exchange for security. So the important conclusion they take from their study is that how much individuals are willing to forgo those liberties depends on the conditional relations, in this case, the combined effect of how much they view the threat, the terror risk as threatening, and how much they trust the government. And this is exactly what we have here in this figure. If we focus on the bold line here, the bold line represents those that answer that they are mostly concerned, so they have the highest threat perception. And if you also look at those two lines here, this is the people that are most trusting of the governments. Those people had a very relatively low support for civil rights, for civil liberties. And look at the opposite for one, those who are not that trusting of the government, they're already in the 58%. So again, we can see here that this is the combined relations between threat perception and trust in government that shape that. If we go even into, this is another figure from their paper, and this is with respect to ideologies. So again, the bold line here represents the conservatives. And again, and the x-axis is concern from another terror attacks, which is another measure for threat perception. So those who have high threat perceptions and they're conservative, they have the lowest extent of support for protecting civil liberties compared to liberals. In this case, those who are liberals and are not concerned about terrorism. So just as an example, they have a very high degree of support for civil liberties. So this is the main paper that we have here showing this debate, showing how those different factors actually matter and how in certain contexts people are willing to give up on those liberties. Now, an important last one thing is an important caveat I want to mention. The survey and the data was collected very close to 9/11, which may have been part of the explanation for how strong those results are. We can see that those who are very concerned about attack here have a very low support for civil liberties. It is possible that some of those attitudes have changed since then, but still, it's again providing us the evidence for the question that we had in mind here, that during those times with high threats, high national security threat, people are willing to accept more extreme measures by the government. The next paper that I had in the syllabus that you had for today was the Geva and the Garcia and Geva paper. They test the same question with respect to civil liberties and national security debate, but they used an experiment. And that's the main reason I wanted to talk about this paper more from the methodological standpoint. So the use of an experiment allows the researchers to manipulate the information that the people that answer the survey are exposed to. For example, what kind of restrictions are they facing, how threatening is the situation, and therefore it provides a much more accurate, direct measure of the causal effect. How much is those factors contribute to support for restricting policies or support for civil liberties. So this is the important role that the method here, the experiment, serves. So for this paper, the Garcia and Gueva paper, they account for two different types of threat, either a domestic terrorism or transnational terrorism. And an important element that they account for is the effectiveness of the proposed counterterrorism policy. They describe this second factor, the effectiveness of policy, as a moderating factor, because if a policy is not seen as effective, then it should not be accepted, even if the threat is very, very high. This is the way that they describe this factor. To explain the extent of support by the public to either civil liberties or national security, they rely on social identity theory, which links our identity, the way that we describe ourselves, to our social situation. They argue that domestic attacks, domestic terrorism, is less likely to garner support for reducing civil liberties, mostly because the public views domestic attacks as they are part of our own society. It's mostly criminal acts that we can use the police to account for, and we does not have to involve policies that severely affect our civil liberties. At the same time, it's not completely clear how can we distinguish between hate crimes and domestic terrorism. In addition, since in most cases hate crimes are not targeting the entire population, they target certain groups. It makes it less likely that if people think about domestic terrorism as hate crime, that they will support any kind of restriction of their rights. But this is the way that they describe it. So I want to show you a few things. This is the important part for me for this specific paper, the method itself, the experiment itself, and how can you control some of those factors and actually find support. So they have two treatments, which is the information that respondents are facing, and you can change it. So you have high lethality, which is high threat perception, and low lethality, which is low threat perception. So I'll just give you the text. It's going to be a lot of text, but just to give you a sense of what it means. So this is high threat perception. It describes an attacks in this case, because it was measured here in Texas. So they describe attacks in Houston and Dallas with a lot of casualties. In this case, 86 federal employees, 140 civilians, additional threats by the terrorism. The description of the Homeland Security Advisory System has made high threats about the situation, and it's possible that more attacks are coming. So this is the high threat condition. So some of the people that answered the survey were exposed to this information. They were supposed to think that the situation is very, very dangerous. At the same time, we have a low threat. Again, in this case, you have just 2 injuries and no civilian casualties. The Homeland Advisory System is remained as not high risk, and it should not. The scenario describes that there shouldn't be any more attacks in the future. So this is how you, from a method standpoint, from an experimental standpoint, separate between those who are in the high threat condition and the low threat condition, and try to estimate how that's going to impact their support for different policies. Then I told you that the second factors they accounted for was the effectiveness of the policies. So in this case, is how invasive are the policies that were offered. So this is the high invasive policy. So it's described as some kind of a legislation which imposes a lot of restrictions on immigration, personal privacy rights, information privacy. There's even specific sections which allow collection of personal and financial information. You can see everything here on the slides this is from the experiment itself, some of the information, again, intended to provide the respondent that faced this condition that the policy offered to address the threat of national security is very, very restrictive. It's very invasive. The low invasive offers very, very little in this case, just additional standard for citizenship, admission, very, very small number of limitations for travel visas and stuff like that. So everything is intended to be much lower in terms of invasive policy. So this is how they built their experiment to try and differentiate between those two levels of policy invasiveness and how threatening is the situation. So in terms of their findings, they find that indeed effectiveness is a very crucial factor. When the measures are viewed as effective, then the support for those kinds of policies, even very, very evasive policies, is very, very high. And these results across the entire population that they study in the experiment is much stronger for transnational terrorism. When it comes to domestic terrorism, then the results are actually the opposite, because even a very high threatening domestic terrorism incident and a policy which is described as very effective is not supported. So what they find in this case is that the threat level can be similar for domestic terrorism or transnational terrorism, but how much does the public support the invasive policies is very, very different, which means that the way that this is viewed by the public is very, very different, domestic threat versus transnational threat. All right, so those are the two studies that you had in the slides in the syllabus that I wanted mostly to talk about with respect to the security and civil liberties dilemma. As you can see, the context is very, very important here. Transnational terrorism incidents in both of those studies is much more powerful in reducing the extent of importance of those civil liberties in exchange for national security. The last paper I want to quickly talk about is a paper that addresses the civil rights or kind of the civil liberties of those who are suspects of terrorism. And this is based on the study by Piazza from 2015. So the motivation for his study is a previous work which suggested that overall, and we saw some of that in the Davis and Silver paper as well, that the American citizens do not accept very extreme practices in terms of interrogation of suspects, and how do we treat suspects of terrorism or perpetrators of terrorism. But some of this data also showed some support for practices which is not that extreme. For example, some of those kind of practices that were common in places such as Guantanamo, and I can tell you from my experience that in some of the political detainees in Israel, they also use some of those methods, is what's called the keeping the detainees in stress position, which is a very uncomfortable position to sit in for a lot of time, subjecting them to a lot of noise, sleep deprivation, and more harsh interrogation. Also, there was some previous information that there is some level of support for government actions, such as keep people detained with no access to lawyers or without pressing official charges, which is again the opposite of some of the important civil rights that we have as part of the due judicial process when we're facing those kinds of charges. And again, this is the lower end of the interrogation methods. There's more extreme ones which we can talk about, that we can think about in this context. Waterboarding is one pretty extreme one, which is practically putting a suspect almost in a drowning position until he provides the information we're looking for, or exposure to extreme heat and cold. And all that is previous information, previous evidence that we had there regarding to how much do American citizens support those methods or reject those methods. On the vast majority, there is mostly rejection of those methods. Now, what Piazza wanted to do was to focus on the threat of terrorism and put that in the context of the religious affiliation of the perpetrators. So he focused on the religious affiliation mostly because since 9/11, when we're thinking about terrorism threats, we're thinking about mostly Islamic terrorism or Arab terrorism. And the question that he asked, if the terrorism threat is based on Islamic suspects, do members of the public support more harsh measures? And why is this support? We already know, and I've talked in the previous lecture and early on about the psychology of threat perception, and mostly the rejection of any kind of outgroup members. So Islamic or Arab terrorists represent an external threat for our in-group, so we are rejecting them. We will accept more harsh measures in order to prevent the threat that they represent. His main expectations is that the support is going to be much lower when the suspects are Anglo-Americans or are members of domestic right-wing terrorism groups compared to Islamic or Arab terrorism groups. He conducts his experiments using a little over 1,000 participants during 2011, And the main way that he uses to differentiate between Muslims or not Muslims is using different affiliation. The name of the groups that the suspects are affiliated with are either Muslim or non-Muslim names, and the same is the names of the suspects themselves. So what does he find overall? And I hope you can see in those slides, it's a little small, but some of the information is obvious here. For the more extreme interrogation measures, there's a very, very low support. For example, you can see here in the top line, applying electric shock, so holding the suspect's head underwater, which is the waterboarding one, which I talked about, is a very low support. At the same time, there's a little bit more support for less extreme measures, such as sleep deprivation or exposing him to a lot of noise. One of the important aspects that he does find that there is much larger extent of support for those lower end measures of interrogation when the suspects are Islamic, but not when they are right-wing suspects or Anglo-American studies. So again, the religion in this case is a very important one, or the way that we think about who those suspects are is very important. What kind of measures we are accepting in interrogating them and making sure that there's not going to be any more attacks. One last thing about the Piazza paper before I'll go back to it for a second, is that the data, I remind you, was collected somewhere around 2011, which is about 10 years after a significant terrorism threat was apparent for the US. It was 10 years after 9/11. At the same time, terrorism was still a top issue in the news because of the Iraq war, which was at the final stages, the war in Afghanistan, and everything that's happening with Al-Qaeda in those years. So we still get some kind of variation in the results, and we can start, if we use this kind of questions, this kind of experiment, the way that Piazza did that, and measure that in the US right after 9/11, we can think about how those results might have been very, very different. Or if we do that in France in 2015-16, after the ISIS attacks, those results might have been very, very different. But we still see that there is variation here. Overall, the American population is still against harsh measures, but that's very much dependent on the context. So this is the end of our discussion regarding psychological and social effects of terrorism. Again, if you have any questions, you're welcome to email me. Reminding you once again what I had early on when I just started talking for today, the attendance issues. So today's attendance word, I kept it to the end just to make it a little bit more interesting. So the attendance word of today is Oxford. Oxford, like the university. So after you finish watching the video, I remind you, you have to send me an email telling me today I'll watch the video on the second video on the psychological effects of terrorism, and the attendance word of the day was Oxford. Reminding you also one thing, by Friday, I'm asking to get an email from each and every one of you who you're going to write your final paper with and what's going to be the case. I will see you all on Friday, and try to stay safe and email me if you have any kind of concerns. Bye, everyone.